How's it going, everybody? It's Ollie from Marcel 1000. Today is January 5th, 2021, and today we're going to forecast the rest of the winter 2021 season, which includes January, February, and even going to March, since a lot of you guys in the United States still experience a multitude of snowstorms in March. So let's get into it. Since it's relatively quiet in the weather right now, I want to take a look at what is in store for us for the rest of 2021 in terms of this winter season. I'm not talking about the 2021-2022 season. It's still too early to predict that. However, we could predict the general outlook for at least the next month or two, which includes January and February and March of this year. And currently we're in January, early January, so there's still a lot of January to go. So let's get into the forecast. So right now, the current forecast for the rest of the winter is a La Nina phase. And you see that during the La Nina phase, we have the polar jet stream pretty much have having a big dip, or not dip, there's a pretty big ridge dominating the northern Pacific, which is forcing this jet stream to bump up northward closer to Alaska. And along with it is that there's a big dip, well, a relatively big dip in the jet stream. And since the Pacific jet during the La Nina phase is just south of the ridge and moves straight towards the east, that means that you typically the Pacific Northwest gets impacted by a multitude of mid-latitude cyclones and a lot more low pressure systems. And if you saw my prior videos, you could tell that there's a lot of mid-latitude cyclones impacting the Northwest Pacific at this time, because we're just seeing that Pacific jet stream completely just dominate the Pacific Northwest and it's just bringing a lot of low pressure systems along the coast, which is bringing a lot of wet conditions. We're seeing snow in a lot of the higher elevations in the Northwest Pacific, and it even extends as far south as Rocky Mountain ranges of Colorado. So it's definitely been more moist than usual when it comes to the Pacific Northwest. And then if we move further to the eastward, you see that for a lot of South, typically during La Nina phase, it's typically dry and warm. And you see that there's a wet portion, right, I would say right around the Ohio River Valley, just south of the Great Lakes region. So during the La Nina phase, it's typical to see more wet conditions right around the Ohio River Valley and maybe extending to the mid-Atlantic and maybe the Northeast, since we're seeing that polar jet move directly through your area during a La Nina phase. So, and to show you guys the probability of a La Nina phase extending for the rest of the winter, you see that there was, this is as of the October 2020 forecast. You see that there was the National Weather Service forecasted a 90% chance of a La Nina phase, and pretty much certain that that's pretty much certain at that point when we're talking about a 90% chance. So, and there's only a 10% chance of a neutral phase. So it seems like La Nina is going to be the phase that's going to occur all through January, February, and March. And you might want to point out that this forecast only extends from November and January, so this might not extend to February and March. However, I still find the chances that La Nina that or neutral phase occurs unlikely, because if we take a look at the history of the La Nina phase over the past several months, we've been in a La Nina phase pretty much since August 2020, or to be more technical, the La Nina really started around October 2020, because for a La Nina for the Nino 3.4 area to be considered in a La Nina phase, it needs to be at least 0.5 degrees Celsius cooler for three consecutive months, and that started right around October 2020. And since then, it really hasn't changed. And if anything, it's only gotten a little bit cooler in right around the Nino 3.4 region, which is the region that most meteorologists and scientists take a look at when determining whether we're in a El Nino phase or La Nina phase. So it seems, and you see that we're still far from the negative 0.5 degrees Celsius threshold to really see a major difference in terms of the sea surface temperature in the Nino 3.4 phase, and it's gonna take a while for the for the Pacific to really warm, for the Nino 3.4 to really warm to the point where we're not in a La Nina phase anymore. And if we take a look at the November and December difference, while the Nino 3.4 phase has risen in average sea surface temperature by around 0.27 degrees Celsius, it's still far from enough to take us out of the La Nina phase. And even if over the next several months the sea surface temperatures begin to warm up in the Nino 3.4 phase, it's going to take a while before we're completely out of the La Nina phase. And I think that it's not gonna be until the spring where we're really gonna get maybe out of the La Nina phase and maybe into more of the neutral phase, and that'll be way too late at that point to really change anything for the winter, since obviously the winter ends, right, I would say around March. Yeah, it ends in March technically speaking, but for some people it ends in April. So by the time I think the phase maybe changes in neutral, it's going to be too late, and it's going to be spring by that time. So it's likely that the La Nina phase will stick around through January, February, and March of this year, which is definitely important to consider, because the La Nina and El Nino phases are definitely important in determining what type of winter you'll experience, and this gives us a rough estimate of how this winter is going to look like. However, that's still far from all that we need to consider when determining what impacts you'll see this winter for the United States. We also need to take a look at the Arctic oscillation, which is very interesting because it's another pattern that really helps us determine what type of winter you'll see over the next several weeks, and its phases could be forecasted weeks ahead, which is very helpful in determining what type of winter you'll experience, especially in the short-term future and even the long-term future at that. So to explain what Arctic oscillation is, it's pretty much when the jet is pretty much a pattern that really has a system of a low pressure and a high pressure. And when the low pressure in the northern Atlantic is stronger and the high pressure in the middle Atlantic is stronger, that means that the westerly winds are a lot more stronger through the mid latitudes of the northern hemisphere. And as a result, the jet stream is stronger, and since the jet stream is stronger in the lower levels and upper levels, and the winds facing the east, coming from the west, are stronger, that means that the cold air you see in the Arctic, right around Canada and Greenland, is more likely to move in a westerly direction. And what that means for the United States is that the cold air is less likely to meander southward or move southward, because the jet stream winds are so strong that the westerly winds are pushing that cold air further westward rather than further southward, in a case where the jet stream would be weaker. But since it's strong in a positive oscillation, that means that the winds coming from the west are strong enough to divert that cooler air further westward rather than meander southward to the United States. However, that the opposite occurs during a negative oscillation, since during a weaker high pressure event and a weaker low pressure event occur, that means that the westerly winds are typically much weaker and the jet stream winds are much weaker during this scenario, because obviously when there's a weaker high pressure, there's less dense air that's sinking, there's less and really that means that there's less dense air that can move into the slow pressure system. And since there's less dense air that can move to the slow pressure system, that means that the winds are typically weaker right around the jet stream. And since the westerly winds are weaker, that cold air is less likely to move from a westerly direction, and it's more likely to meander, because those jet stream winds aren't strong enough to divert that cold air away from the United States or to prevent it from meandering south. And during a negative oscillation, we typically see a lot more jet stream dips. It's a lot colder in the United States, and as a result, we see a lot more snowstorms in the United States. So during a negative oscillation, that's where you typically see the biggest cold blasts, biggest snowstorms in the United States, and it's very important in determining what type of winter you'll experience. So in terms of how the Arctic oscillation is doing right now, you see that we're deep in the negative phase right around early January, where I would say we're -2, we're in the -2 air in terms of negativity of the Arctic oscillation, the -2 threshold in terms of the Arctic oscillation index. And as you can see, we've been in a negative Arctic oscillation since early December, and it really hasn't recovered. There was a little bit of a bump right around Christmas time of December. However, it still wasn't enough to reach that positive Arctic oscillation threshold, and we're seeing that negative Arctic oscillation threshold continue, and you see that it's not expected to change over the next several weeks, because even if you move forward past the 16th, most of the forecast models are predicting that we're going to stay in the Arctic oscillation. So during this scenario, we're more likely to see a lot more jet stream dips and a lot more cold blasts move through the United States, and we're more like, and as a result of the bigger jet stream dips and the Arctic blasts, we're more likely to see bigger and more snowstorms that are induced by that instability from the jet stream dips. And also, it's more likely that the rain from the United States low pressure systems will change over to snow as a result of the increased Arctic jet stream dips through the United States. And so we definitely need to consider that when determining the winter forecast for the next several months. And while the Arctic oscillation, while the computer models forecast the Arctic oscillation in the short-term future, only around 2 weeks ahead, it's very important to really look at the historical data of the Arctic oscillation, because as you can see, usually when we're in a positive or negative Arctic oscillation, it takes several months for it to recover or maybe change its positive or negative phase during the next couple of months. And you see that there's a lot of negative phases, and the negative phase continues for months ahead. And you see that the positive phase, it took a while for it to go to a negative phase, because the positive started around October and it didn't enter the negative phase until December. So we could at least expect the negative phase to continue at least until February, which would mean that January is likely going to be a much colder month than you typically see in the United States, because of this negative Arctic oscillation. And February still has yet to be seen. However, I do expect in February, since we've been in a negative Arctic oscillation for at least a month now, I do expect February to maybe recover back to a positive Arctic oscillation, because there's only so much time the United States could be in a negative or positive Arctic oscillation. So it's safe to assume that it will eventually go over into the positive phase Arctic oscillation threshold in February. However, I would say for most of January, definitely expect bigger and stronger snowstorms in the United States and cooler than average temperatures for the most part. And the computer models are definitely agreeing with that there's going to be much more colder temperatures and a lot more jet stream dips as a result of this Arctic oscillation. And it's very important to determine this when making a forecast in terms of what you will experience during the winter time. So I also want to take a look at another factor that could also determine what type of winter you'll see in the United States, and that's Atlantic sea surface temperatures. While I don't think the sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic make a huge difference in terms of what type of winter you'll see over the next couple of months. However, any like small details I want to point out have to be pointed out since they could definitely change, because every small detail in the weather could make a major difference in terms of what impacts you'll see. And it's very important to take a look at the Atlantic sea surface temperatures, um, to determine what type of winter you'll see, especially along the coast. And you see that most of the southeast and a lot of the mid-Atlantic is has sea surface temperatures just off the coast cooler than average. And what this means is that if there's any low pressure systems or a jet stream dip that moves through the United States, bringing a low pressure system, I would say the coastal cities are more likely to experience snow or temperatures slightly below average, which could be huge when it comes to the snowfall you'll see because again, any small differences in temperature can make a huge difference between rain and snow, especially along the coast. And just a degree or two cooler than what you typically see could make a major difference in terms of how much snowfall you'll receive, because it could make the difference between 12 inches of snow to nearly nothing. 34 degrees could mean no snow for you. However, 32 degrees could mean a lot more snow for you guys along the coastal cities. And while it's already unlikely that the southeast will experience any major snowstorms from this, especially along the coast, even with the lower sea surface temperatures, it's still important to point out that there's more likely of a chance that temperatures around the coastal regions in the southeast will be cooler than average, thanks to the cooler than average sea surface temperatures. However, the La Nina might make up for that more than enough. So it's still more likely that you'll see maybe around above average temperatures despite the cooler than average water temperatures. However, it's still something important to point out. And then I want to also point out that the Great Lakes are warmer than average at this point in terms of sea surface temperatures, and that could be huge because if the Great Lakes never really freeze, then we're more likely there's a more likely chance you're going to see a more enhanced lake effect snow event in the Great Lakes during headed into January, February, and March of this year. So it's definitely important to keep that in mind. Um and I definitely took that into consideration when making that forecast. So without further ado, let me go over my forecast prediction for the 2020 winter season for the rest of the season, which includes January, February, and March of this year. So for a lot of the for the coastal, I would say the I-95 corridor of the East Coast and extending to maybe the northern portions of the Southeast, I'm expecting a lot of mixing to occur. And what this means is that I expect that there's going to be a lot of low pressure systems that move through the this area, because like I said, the La Nina will bring jet stream this far south, and there's going to be a lot of low pressure systems that move through this area. I also think the Arctic oscillation will enhance jet stream this, which will bring a lot more low pressure system through this area. However, I do expect that since it's a La Nina phase, the jet stream, despite the negative Arctic oscillation, will be a little bit further northward to bring a little bit more warm air than what you typically see during a negative Arctic oscillation. And I think that could make make a lot of these cities maybe miss out on a couple of snow events, since there's going to be a lot more warm air entraining the coastal cities. And I also think that however, I also think that thanks to the negative Arctic oscillation, there's a chance they're going to see more snow from this, some snow in this region, so keep that in mind. And then I expect the worst of the snow to be obviously in the blue, because the Arctic oscillation combined with the La Nina bringing a jet stream with a lot of low pressure systems with it is going to bring a lot more snow in this region. I also expect it to be colder for the most part throughout the northern United States, thanks to a negative Arctic oscillation that's expected to occur. And then I expect mainly average temperatures and average precipitation for along the Northeast, because while there will be an Arctic oscillation, which I believe will make the air more unstable and create a lot more convection in this region when it comes to precipitation, and will bring cooler than average temperatures typically. I also think that the La Nina phase will have somewhat of an effect in the southeast as well. And if we take a look at what's typical for a La Nina phase, it's usually dry and warm throughout the southeast. However, I think the mixture of the Arctic oscillation and the La Nina will pretty much mix the weather patterns together to create primarily an average temperature and average precipitation rest of the winter for those in the southeast. And I expect it to be cold and moist as a result of strong La Nina and an Arctic oscillation bringing a lot of mid-latitude cyclones to the Pacific Northwest. And I expect it to be mild and dry right around the extreme southern portions of the United States, which includes Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, because there isn't really going to be much of a jet stream that's going to move through this area. So yeah, guys, this is my winter forecast prediction. Again, take this with a grain of salt, because definitely a lot could change and it isn't 100% precise. However, I would at least take this forecast with more I would at least take this forecast with more certainty than uncertainty, because again, forecast models and weather patterns are very reliable in terms of are getting reliable in terms of what type of winter you'll see. And definitely take this with a grain of salt, but think that it's more likely than not. But anyways, guys, I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather related content. Make sure to like if you like this video, and make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see more weather related content.